If you're new here, you're in for a treat. This is where stories come alive, where emotions run high, and every twist leaves you breathless. Today's tale is one of arrogance, humility, and the kind of karma that hits harder than a freight train. So grab a seat, get comfortable, and let's dive into a story that will remind you why respect is something you should never take for granted. The city was alive, as it always was. Skyscrapers pierced the clouds, their glass facades reflecting the golden hues of the setting sun. Streets buzzed with the rhythmic chaos of honking cars, hurried footsteps, and the occasional laughter of people spilling out of cafes. But amidst the urban symphony, one place stood out, a restaurant called La Maison d'Or. It wasn't just any restaurant, it was the restaurant. The kind of place where reservations were booked months in advance, where the rich and powerful gathered to see and be seen. Its doors were guarded by a velvet rope, and its reputation was as immaculate as the white tablecloths inside. To dine there was to belong to an exclusive club, and everyone wanted in. Enter Ethan Carter. At 28, Ethan was the picture of success. His tailored suit hugged his frame perfectly. His Rolex gleamed under the city lights, and his confidence, some might call it arrogance, radiated like a force field. He was a rising star in the world of finance, a man who had clawed his way to the top and made sure everyone knew it. But tonight, Ethan wasn't thinking about his accomplishments. He was stressed, impatient, and running late. His phone buzzed incessantly as he power walked down the sidewalk, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement. A deal was on the line, a big one, and he needed to seal it over dinner at La Maison d'Or. But the traffic had been a nightmare. His Uber had canceled, and now he was cutting it dangerously close. As he approached the restaurant, his eyes darted to the entrance, where a small crowd had gathered. His pulse quickened. He didn't have time for this. He didn't have time for anything. And then he saw him. An old man, hunched and frail, sat on a bench just outside the restaurant. His clothes were worn, his face lined with years of hardship. In his hands, he held a small paper bag, the contents of which had spilled onto the ground, a few apples rolling toward Ethan's feet. The old man looked up, his eyes apologetic, and began to reach for the apples. But Ethan was already stepping around him, his face twisted in annoyance. "Watch where you're going, old man," Ethan snapped, his voice sharp enough to cut through the hum of the crowd. The old man froze, his hand hovering over an apple. He opened his mouth to apologize, but Ethan was already striding toward the restaurant, his mind racing with thoughts of his meeting. He didn't look back, but he should have. Ethan reached the entrance of La Maison d'Or, his irritation simmering just beneath the surface. The host, a young man in a crisp black suit, stood behind the podium, flipping through the reservation book. Ethan straightened his tie and approached, his tone clipped. "Ethan Carter, I have a reservation for 7:30. The host glanced up, his expression polite but hesitant. "Ah, Mr. Carter, just one moment, please." Ethan's jaw tightened. He didn't have time for one moment. He was already late, and every second wasted was a second closer to losing the deal. His eyes flicked toward the crowd outside, where the old man was still sitting on the bench, now carefully placing the spilled apples back into his paper bag. Ethan's lip curled in disdain. What's he even doing here? This isn't a place for. Before he could finish, the old man stood up, clutching his bag. He took a tentative step toward the restaurant, his movements slow and unsteady. Ethan turned away, his attention snapping back to the host, who was still flipping through the book. "Sir, I'm sorry, but it seems..." Ethan didn't let him finish. "Look, I don't have time for this. I made a reservation weeks ago. Just seat me." The host opened his mouth to respond, but at that moment, the old man shuffled closer, his eyes downcast. He muttered something under his breath, his voice barely audible. Ethan didn't catch the words, but he didn't care. He was too focused on the host, who was now stammering an apology. And then it happened. The old man, perhaps distracted or unsteady on his feet, accidentally bumped into Ethan. The paper bag slipped from his hands and the apples tumbled out once more, rolling across the polished floor of the restaurant's entrance. Ethan froze, his patience snapping like a taut wire. He turned to the old man, his face red with anger. "Are you kidding me?" he barked, his voice loud enough to draw the attention of everyone nearby. "Watch where you're going, you useless old fool." The old man flinched, his hands trembling as he bent down to pick up the apples. I'm sorry, sir, he stammered, his voice soft and apologetic. It was an accident. But Ethan wasn't listening. His ego, already bruised by the host's hesitation, now flared into full-blown rage. He stepped closer, towering over the old man. An accident? You're standing in front of a high-end restaurant, looking like a homeless person, and you think sorry is enough? Get out of the way before I call security. The old man's eyes widened, but he didn't argue. He simply nodded, his shoulders slumping as he gathered the last of the apples. The crowd outside had stopped to watch, their murmurs growing louder. Some looked shocked, others disgusted, but no one intervened. Ethan turned back to the host, his chest heaving. Now, about my table. But the host's expression had changed. His polite smile was gone, replaced by a look of cold disapproval. Mr. Carter, he said slowly, I'm afraid we won't be able to accommodate you tonight. Ethan blinked, his anger momentarily replaced by confusion. What are you talking about? I have a reservation. The host's gaze flicked toward the old man, who was now standing quietly to the side, his head bowed. Then he looked back at Ethan, his voice firm. I'm afraid your behavior is not in line with the values of this establishment. We must ask you to leave. Ethan's mouth fell open. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. You're kicking me out? Over him? He gestured wildly at the old man, his voice rising. Do you even know who I am? The host didn't flinch. Yes, Mr. Carter, and I'm afraid that doesn't matter. Ethan's face burned with humiliation. He opened his mouth to argue, but before he could say another word, a deep, commanding voice cut through the tension. Is there a problem here? Ethan turned, and his stomach dropped. Standing in the doorway of the restaurant was a tall, broad-shouldered man in an impeccably tailored suit. His dark eyes were sharp, his expression unreadable. But what made Ethan's blood run cold was the way the old man's face lit up at the sight of him. Miguel, the old man said softly, his voice filled with warmth. The man, Miguel, stepped forward, his gaze shifting from Ethan to the old man. Papa, he said, his tone gentle. Are you all right? Ethan's heart stopped. Papa? No, it couldn't be. But it was. The old man wasn't just some random stranger. He was Miguel Alvarez, the owner of La Maison d'Or, and Ethan had just made the biggest mistake of his life. Ethan stood frozen in the entrance of La Maison d'Or, his mind racing as the pieces fell into place. The old man, Mr. Alvarez, wasn't just some random stranger. He was the father of Miguel Alvarez, the owner of the restaurant, and Ethan had just insulted him in front of everyone. Miguel's gaze shifted from his father to Ethan, his expression hardening. Is this the man who disrespected you, Papa? He asked, his voice calm but laced with an edge that sent a chill down Ethan's spine. The old man nodded, his eyes downcast. It was an accident, Miguel. I didn't mean to. It's all right, Papa, Miguel interrupted gently, placing a hand on his father's shoulder. You don't need to explain. Then he turned to Ethan, his demeanor changing instantly. The warmth he'd shown his father was gone, replaced by a cold, steely resolve. Mr. Carter, is it? Ethan swallowed hard, his earlier bravado crumbling under the weight of Miguel's gaze. Yes, he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. Miguel stepped closer, his presence commanding the room. Do you have any idea who you just insulted? Ethan opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. His mind was a whirlwind of panic and regret. He glanced at the old man, who was now standing quietly beside his son, his expression a mix of sadness and disappointment. I didn't know. Ethan finally managed to say, his voice trembling. I didn't realize. That he was my father? Miguel finished for him, his tone sharp. Does it matter? Would you have treated him differently if you knew who he was? Ethan's face burned with shame. He wanted to argue, to explain that he was stressed, that he hadn't meant to cause a scene. But the words felt hollow, even to him. Miguel didn't wait for a response. He turned to the host, who was still standing behind the podium, his expression tense. Carlos, cancel Mr. Carter's reservation and make sure he's added to our blacklist. The host nodded, his relief evident. Right away, sir. Ethan's stomach dropped. Wait, he said, his voice desperate. You can't do this. I'm a loyal customer. I've been coming here for years. Miguel's eyes narrowed. And yet, you've shown no loyalty to the values this restaurant stands for. Respect, humility, kindness, these are not just words to us, Mr. Carter. They are the foundation of everything we do. And you've proven tonight that you don't share those values. Ethan's mind raced, searching for a way to salvage the situation. I'll apologize, he said quickly, turning to the old man. Sir, I'm sorry. I was out of line. I didn't mean to. The old man held up a hand, silencing him. It's not me you need to apologize to, he said softly. It's yourself. Ethan blinked, confused. What? The old man's gaze was steady, his eyes filled with a quiet wisdom. You've forgotten what it means to be human, young man. To treat others with dignity, no matter who they are or where they come from. Until you learn that, no apology will mean anything. Ethan stared at him, his chest tightening. He wanted to argue to defend himself, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he felt a sinking realization, a truth he'd been avoiding for far too long. Miguel stepped forward, his voice firm. I think it's time for you to leave, Mr. Carter. Ethan nodded numbly, his pride shattered. He turned and walked out of the restaurant, the eyes of the crowd burning into his back. The once coveted entrance of La Maison d'Or now felt like a prison gate slamming shut behind him. Outside, the city buzzed with its usual energy, but Ethan felt disconnected from it all. He stood on the sidewalk, his mind replaying the events of the evening. The old man's words echoed in his head, a haunting reminder of his own failings. Respect is earned, not demanded. Ethan had spent his life chasing success, climbing the ladder at any cost, but in doing so, he'd lost sight of what truly mattered. And now, standing alone on the busy street, he felt the weight of that loss more than ever. Ethan stepped out of La Maison d'Or, the cool evening air hitting him like a slap. The hum of the city seemed distant, muffled by the roaring in his ears. He could still feel the weight of everyone's stares, patrons, staff, even passersby who had witnessed the scene. Their whispers followed him like a shadow, each word a needle pricking his pride. Did you see that? Someone murmured. Who does he think he is? Another voice chimed in. Ethan kept his head down, his face burning with humiliation. He had always prided himself on his confidence, his ability to command respect wherever he went. But now that confidence felt like a brittle shell, shattered by his own arrogance. He walked a few steps away from the restaurant, his legs feeling unsteady beneath him. The weight of what had just happened settled heavily on his shoulders. He replayed the scene in his mind. The way he'd snapped at the old man, the way he'd made a spectacle of him, the way Miguel had looked at him with such cold disdain. For the first time in years, Ethan felt small. He turned back toward the restaurant, his heart pounding. He couldn't just leave it like this. He had to fix it. He had to apologize. The old man was still standing near the entrance, his paper bag of apples clutched in his hands. Miguel was beside him, speaking softly, but the old man's eyes were distant, as if lost in thought. Ethan hesitated, his pride warring with his guilt. Finally, he took a deep breath and approached them. Sir, he began, his voice trembling, I need to apologize. The old man looked up, his expression calm but unreadable. Miguel's eyes narrowed, but he didn't say anything, allowing his father to respond. I was wrong, Ethan continued, his words tumbling out in a rush. I was stressed, and I took it out on you. That wasn't right. I'm sorry. The old man studied him for a moment, his gaze piercing. Then he sighed, his shoulders sagging slightly. Young man, he said quietly, do you know why I come here every evening? Ethan blinked, caught off guard. And no, he admitted. The old man gestured to the bench where he'd been sitting earlier. I come here to watch people, to see the world go by, and every day I see people like you, so busy, so focused on themselves that they forget the people around them. They forget what it means to be kind. Ethan's throat tightened. I didn't mean to. It's not about meaning to, the old man interrupted gently. It's about choosing to. Every day we have a choice, to lift others up or to tear them down. Today, you chose the latter. Ethan looked down, his shame overwhelming. I didn't think. The old man nodded. That's the problem. You didn't think. You didn't see me as a person. You saw me as an inconvenience. Ethan opened his mouth to argue, but the words died on his lips. The old man was right. He had been so consumed by his own problems that he hadn't even considered the man in front of him. The old man straightened, his voice firm but not unkind. Respect is earned, not demanded. Remember that. With that, he turned and walked away, his son following close behind. Ethan stood there, rooted to the spot as the weight of the old man's words sank in. Respect, humility, kindness. These were things he had taken for granted, things he had thought were owed to him. But now he realized how wrong he had been. As the old man disappeared into the restaurant, Ethan felt a strange mix of emotions: shame, regret, but also a glimmer of something else, a determination to be better. But first, he had to face the consequences of his actions. Weeks had passed since the incident at La Maison d'Or, and Ethan's life had changed in ways he never expected. His once flourishing career was now in shambles. Word of his outburst had spread like wildfire through the tight-knit business community, and his partners had begun distancing themselves. Meetings were canceled, deals fell through, and the phone calls that once flooded his inbox had dwindled to silence. Ethan had always believed that success was measured by wealth and power. But now, sitting alone in his penthouse apartment, he realized how hollow those things felt without respect and integrity. One evening, he found himself standing outside La Maison d'Or once again. The restaurant was as elegant as ever, its golden lights casting a warm glow onto the sidewalk. But this time, Ethan wasn't there to demand a table or flaunt his status. He was there to make amends. He took a deep breath and stepped inside. The host, Carlos, recognized him immediately, his expression wary. "Mr. Carter," Carlos said cautiously, "what can I do for you?" Ethan held up his hands in a gesture of peace. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I need to speak with Miguel. Please." Carlos hesitated, then nodded. "Wait here." A few minutes later, Miguel emerged from the kitchen, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Carter," he said, his tone neutral, "what brings you here?" Ethan swallowed hard, his nerves threatening to get the better of him. "I came to apologize," he said, his voice steady but sincere. "Not just to you, but to your father. I was wrong, and I know that now." Miguel crossed his arms, studying Ethan carefully. "And what do you expect from this apology?" "Nothing," Ethan replied quickly. "I don't expect forgiveness. I needed you to know that I'm trying to change, that I want to be better." Miguel was silent for a moment, his gaze piercing. Then he sighed, his expression softening slightly. "My father isn't here tonight," he said, "but even if he were, forgiveness isn't mine to give. It's something you have to earn, not just from him, but from yourself." Ethan nodded, his chest tightening. "I understand." Miguel stepped closer, his voice low but firm. "Respect isn't something you can demand, Mr. Carter. It's something you build, one act of kindness at a time. If you're serious about changing, then start there." Ethan met his gaze, the weight of Miguel's words settling over him. "I will," he said quietly. "Thank you." Miguel gave a small nod, then turned and walked back into the kitchen, leaving Ethan standing alone in the restaurant's elegant foyer. Later that night, Ethan sat at a small cafe a few blocks away, a cup of coffee cooling in front of him. The cafe was quiet, a stark contrast to the bustling energy of La Maison d'Or. But for the first time in weeks, Ethan felt a sense of peace. He thought about the old man's words. Respect is earned, not demanded, and realized how much they had changed him. He had spent so much of his life chasing success, but now he understood that true success wasn't measured by wealth or status. It was measured by the way you treated others, by the kindness you showed, and the humility you carried. Ethan made a silent vow to himself. He would be better, not just for the sake of his career, but for the sake of his soul. Thank you for watching, everyone. This story is a reminder that respect and kindness are choices we make every day. No matter how high we climb, we should never forget the people around us. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more tales that touch the heart and challenge the mind. Until next time, remember, the way we treat others is a reflection of who we truly are. Take care, and I'll see you in the next story.